Welcome to the third week of our series, The Secrets of Every Happy Family. Probably not surprisingly, this series has already generated a lot of discussions in many families, and maybe eventually in your own family. Admittedly, there are many secrets to success for happy families. We're looking at three in particular during this series. The first secret of every happy family is that they accept the messiness of family life. Over and over again in our families, we're going to be running up against the flaws of one another. Happy families consistently choose to accept the flaws of each other with grace and flexibility. The second secret of every happy family is that they have a mutual respect. Mutual respect creates an atmosphere of growth for everyone. And this begins with respect for God's authority over the whole of family life. And then the spouses' mutual respect for one another. In fact, respect is everyone's job in the family. The third secret of every happy family is a commitment to a larger purpose. Happy families know that their relationships are not just about themselves, but they serve a greater mission, a higher purpose in the extended family, in the neighborhood, in their community, and for our culture. Last week, we looked at the role fathers have in happy families. We said that dads have a unique role in providing blessing for their children. And we know this intuitively because we all look to our dads for approval and encouragement. Happy families have fathers who willingly step up to the plate and embrace that role. Today we're looking at another role, the role that mothers play in the family. And obviously I'm even less qualified to talk about this topic today than I was last week. But that's never stopped me before. Now don't worry, in shaping this message, the feminine perspective has been consulted. Plus, we have Scripture. Just as last week we looked at Jesus' relationship with his Father in Scripture, this week in today's Gospel, we're going to look at the relationship Jesus has with his mother. It is Luke's Gospel that tells us the most about Mary, but we get perhaps the most interesting snapshot into the relationship of Jesus and Mary in the Gospel of John. And it is John who tells us the story we heard today. There was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. Now pay attention to the order that John sets up for us here, because this order has a purpose. John puts the mother of Jesus first, and then Jesus, and then the disciples. And we'll get back to this in a little bit. So Mary, Jesus, and the disciples are at a wedding in a town called Cana, not very far from home, but it doesn't go quite as planned. At some point, we're told that Mary comes up to Jesus and informs him that they've run out of wine. Now in those days, a Jewish wedding was a huge deal, lasting several days. The whole town would have been invited to take part in the ceremony and the feasting that would have followed. Hospitality in the Middle East was a huge deal then, just like it is even now for their culture. So running out of wine would have been a huge embarrassment for the couple, bringing the party to an early end and even casting a shadow over the prospects of their married life. Now, Mary must have known the couple well enough to be privy to the problem, and it seems like she was helping to serve at the wedding, so she brings the problem to Jesus, clearly expecting him to do something about it. Instead, check out what he says to her. "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me?" Now, if that sounds like Jesus is pushing back, that's because he is. But Mary, seemingly deaf to his response, you ever get that from your own mom? Seemingly deaf to his response, his mother says to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you. Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars, each holding about 100 liters. So Jesus tells the servants to fill them up with water, and they do that. They fill it right up to the brim. And then he tells them to draw some water out and to take it to the head waiter. And so they do that. They take a sampling to the head waiter, who would have been in charge of the wedding service. And the head waiter tastes the water, which has now been made into wine, and he immediately calls the bridegroom, and he says to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." It seems like Jesus, like myself, appreciates a fine glass of wine. But in all seriousness, this fine wine is a symbol of his abundance and his generosity. See, Jesus provides a superabundance, gallons and gallons of wine, equivalent to about 1,000 bottles of wine in modern day measurements. That's a lot of wine. Finally, in conclusion, John tells us, after this, Jesus went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples. So if you remember at the start of this, when Mary was listed first, well, now the order is switched around. Jesus is listed first, and then his mother, and then the others. Why is that? Well, when Mary tells Jesus about the lack of wine, it's not just about the lack of wine. She's doing something else that is quite significant in the story of the gospel and in the arc of the life of Jesus. See, she knows her son. She knows him. And while the Bible tells us that Jesus had not performed any miracles yet, she is well aware of what he is capable of. And she wants him to get started. But in performing this miracle, events will be set in motion that will lead to the cross. Jesus knows this, and he's checking with her to make sure she knows it too. He's not really hesitating. He's saying, do you know what you're really asking? Do you realize that this is going to change everything, including our relationship, and that our relationship will be different? Up until this point, the Bible tells us that he spent his life in Nazareth and that he was obedient to her. But in making this request, Mary is changing the equation. She's releasing him from her authority. She is releasing him into the world to undertake his mission and his ministry. The roles have changed, and that can take some getting used to. I see this as the sort of thing that all mothers eventually have to go through. Eventually, your kids will grow up and they'll have to move out. And from what I've learned, it can be extremely painful for mothers in particular, and it takes a huge adjustment. Some mothers may feel like they're losing a piece of themselves, and it hurts. But being a mom at that stage is vulnerability at its finest. Right after high school, my parents drove me up to Trent to help me move in on Labor Day weekend. Now here I was getting ready to start a whole new chapter in my life, and I was excited. I was really excited and a little nervous of what lies ahead. My mother seemed like her normal, happy self. She couldn't wait to help me get my room set up and take everything apart and put everything in their proper place. She couldn't wait to help me put everything away. And I just kept saying, "It's fine. Mom, just go home." But years later, actually not all that long ago, reflecting on that day, she told me that she cried the entire car ride home. Her oldest son wasn't a baby anymore, and I had moved out. And when she got home, she stared into my empty room for a long time. She was really proud of me. I'm the first in our family to go off to university, but she was also sad, and she was heartbroken. But happy families are characterized by moms who understand that their role is one of preparation. They're preparing their kids for release into their own lives in the same way that Mary released Jesus into his public ministry. But as Mary herself surely knew, this release is not just a one-time deal. It's going to happen in little ways, and it's going to happen in some large ways too, over and over and over again, in an ever-expanding release until it is a complete release. Because moms are not raising children. They're raising adults. And as such, It's a pretty selfless role because good moms, great moms, are giving everything they have to their kids. And then they have to give their kids away too. Their very success brings about loss. And in a certain sense, it's certainly sadness. Sometimes it is a sadness that moms must bear silently and all alone. And that just doesn't seem fair. It just doesn't seem fair. But it must be so. For the success and for the happiness of the family, it must be so. On the flip side of this story from John's Gospel, we see that happy families are also marked by respect toward mothers. Despite the distance of Jesus' words, in the end, he did exactly as his mother had asked him to do. He honored his mother's request, and he did it in a generous and superabundant kind of way. While the authority of a mother has over her children eventually does come to an end, honor and respect should be permanent features of that relationship. In the Ten Commandments, God himself commands us to honor your father and mother that you may live a long life. It's the only one of the Ten Commandments that brings a promise and a blessing of its own. That's how important this commandment is in the eyes of God. Now, of course, God does say, honor both mother and father, but I think, especially happy families, are marked by a special honor accorded to the mother. And that's because it was such a clear feature in Jesus' own life, for his whole life. In fact, it's only in John's Gospel that we read the very last thing that Jesus ever did was to make provisions for the care of his mother. And he did that from the cross with his very last words. So ladies, when it comes to application for moms, my question is this: are you parenting your child with God's purpose in mind? By which I mean, are you parenting knowing that eventually your job is to let them go, to release them into the world? Are you practicing that on a daily basis? Or are you holding on a bit too tight? Are you trying to control everything, to know everything, to be everything? Honestly, just ask yourself that question. If, on the other hand, your children are now adults, ask yourself if you're respecting their independence and their authority. Now, for the other family members, are you honoring the mother of the family? Now, this means different things at different stages of life, for sure. As an elementary or high school student, that requires obedience. Obedience in what you do, for sure. But also in how you talk to your mother. The tone of voice that you use. The words that you choose. Your body language. And your willingness to lend your attention. All of that is part of honoring your mother. You might not like to hear it, but she actually gets it more than you think. If you're in college, a young adult, or newly married, it might mean giving time to that relationship and bringing your best game when you do that. Not acting like it's a sacrifice or some kind of imposition, but being generous with yourself in that relationship. If your mother is older, perhaps there is patience and kindness and care. That kind now that are required that maybe wasn't a part of your relationship before. If your mother is deceased, you can still honor her. And you should. You must in your thoughts and in your prayers and in your kind remembering of her. The family is an image and reflection of God's love. It's an imperfect reflection for sure, but it is a reflection. In fact, our frustration at its imperfection point us to our desire for something more. And our desire for something more is the family of God. Ultimately, what God is doing in the world is he's building up his family. And the best thing about that is that we get to be a part of it. But here's the thing. We're supposed to be practicing now in our own families.